It started like any other flight, quiet, polite, routine, until a black girl in first class began to cry, and a white flight attendant, instead of helping her, raised a hand in anger. The cabin froze, passengers stared, and then came a calm, commanding voice. "Is there a reason you're putting your hands on my daughter?" In that single moment, power shifted, because the man she'd just disrespected wasn't an ordinary father. He was an Army Captain General, and what followed would expose everything wrong with privilege at 30,000 feet. This is a story of courage, consequence, and justice served midair. If you believe truth still matters, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. The hum of the cabin was soft and steady, the kind of quiet that lives inside long flights. Passengers murmured over half-finished drinks, screens glowed with movies no one really watched, and somewhere near the front, a young black girl sat perfectly still, her small hands folded on her lap, like she'd practiced it. She looked no older than 13, dressed in a neat lilac sweater and white sneakers, too clean for travel. Her name tag, a little pink badge hanging from her backpack strap, read, Kayla J. Thompson. To anyone watching, she looked like just another passenger. But there was something in the way she sat, shoulders pulled in, eyes steady but cautious, that said she knew what it felt like to be watched. The seat beside her was empty. The one across the aisle wasn't. A white woman in her early 30s, hair pinned tight, uniform pressed sharp, watched Kayla like she was a question that didn't belong here. Her name tag gleamed under the reading light. Miss Turner. Kayla had smiled when she first boarded, her father's voice still echoing in her head. Be polite, baby. Respect gets respect. But as the flight stretched on, that lesson started to feel one-sided. It began small, a hesitation when she asked for water, a forced smile that came a little too late, a napkin tossed instead of handed. The kind of moments people pretend not to notice, but they sting all the same. Kayla noticed every one. A man a few rows back glanced over, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Silence was the currency of air travel, and no one liked to spend it. The attendant moved closer now, pretending to adjust a tray. Her tone clipped, her words colder than they needed to be. Kayla tried to make herself smaller. But prejudice doesn't shrink with kindness, it feeds on it. A small tremor passed through her fingers as she reached for her book, the one her dad had given her before leaving for deployment. A photograph slipped out. A man in uniform, smiling in sunlight. Captain Marcus Thompson, U.S. Army. Her father. The attendant saw the picture, and something flickered in her expression. Not recognition, but resistance. The kind that grows when pride feels threatened by innocence. Kayla tucked the photo away, lowering her eyes, hoping that would be the end of it. But in that charged silence, the air seemed to thicken. Every sound, a zipper, cough, the faint clink of a glass, felt like static before a storm. And then the shadow fell over her shoulder. The woman stood too close now, her voice sharper, almost trembling with something that didn't belong in customer service. "Excuse me, young lady," she said. Every head nearby turned slightly, curiosity pricking through their boredom. Kayla's breath caught. She didn't know it yet, but the next 30 seconds would change everything for her, for this flight, and for the woman who thought power came with a uniform. The story of how Kayla Thompson ended up in first class didn't begin on that airplane. It began in a small 2-bedroom home on the edge of Fort Bragg, a place where military families learned to live half their lives in waiting. The mornings in that house were disciplined but gentle. Marcus Thompson, decorated Army captain and single father, ran on a rhythm that was part soldier, part dad. Every morning before sunrise, he'd lace up his boots, stretch quietly in the living room, then pause by Kayla's door. A soft knock followed by, "Rise and shine, baby girl. World ain't gonna wait for you." Kayla would groan, burying herself under the blanket, but he'd always win. By 6:30, she'd be sitting at the kitchen table, still half asleep, staring at the scrambled eggs he made the same way every morning, just a little burnt on the edges, the way she liked. They didn't have much, but they had routine. And in the military, routine was a form of love. Her mother had passed when Kayla was 8, A quiet, lingering illness. The kind that doesn't make noise but leaves echoes. Marcus had never remarried. "No one can replace your mom," he used to tell her, his voice steady but eyes far away. "But I can try to make her proud through you." And he did. He was the kind of father who showed up to every recital, every science fair, every tough night when homework turned to tears. His uniform was sometimes the only one in the crowd, but Kayla didn't mind. It made her proud. To her, that uniform wasn't just fabric and badges. It was the proof that good men still existed, even when the world forgot to thank them. When deployment orders came again, Marcus promised it would be his last one. Just 6 months, he said. 6 months. Then he'd be back home, maybe retire, maybe finally take that vacation he kept talking about. He wanted to show Kayla the world, Paris, Dubai, Ghana, places her mother had dreamed of. But when the army called, duty answered louder than dreams. 2 months later, his mission was extended, then extended again. Kayla had grown used to his absence, the silence filled by his voice messages, steady, warm, reminding her to stay strong. So when his commander surprised him with early leave and a first-class ticket home, he used his return to surprise her instead. He didn't tell her he was coming. He just arranged for her to fly out to Washington, D.C., to meet him there, a father and daughter reunion he'd planned down to the minute. Only, on that flight, he wouldn't be in uniform. Marcus wanted to blend in, to see the world his daughter moved through when he wasn't around, to see how she was treated when people didn't know who she belonged to. He'd boarded that same plane before her, wearing a plain gray hoodie and dark jeans, his seat further back in coach. The flight attendant who'd later stand over his daughter had no idea the man she'd passed by twice was the airline's silent co-owner, an investment he'd made through a military veterans fund a year prior, his name quietly listed under a trust. He hadn't planned to interfere, only to observe. But fate had other plans. Back in first class, Kayla had been nervous even before takeoff. It wasn't her first flight. Her dad had flown with her before, but it was her first time sitting up front. Everything about it felt like it belonged to someone else. The silverware, the quiet conversation, the way passengers seemed to look past her as if she'd wandered into a room she wasn't invited to. She tried to be invisible, just like her dad taught her when people looked too long. "Sometimes the loudest way to stand tall," he'd said, "is to say nothing." Still, she could feel the eyes, especially the attendants. Miss Turner had greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind people wear when they're checking a list in their head. Too young, too alone, too brown for first class. But Kayla had handed over her ticket confidently, exactly as her father instructed, saying thank you, ma'am, with perfect manners. The woman's brow had tightened just slightly before she waved her through. Now, sitting near the front of the cabin, Kayla kept her head low, headphones in, listening to a playlist her dad made for her, old R&B songs mixed with favorite jazz tracks. Each song carried something familiar, something grounding. The seat beside her remained empty. It was meant for him. If she turned back just once before takeoff, she might have seen him, Marcus, seated quietly near the aisle, pretending to scroll his phone, but watching her through the small gap between seats. Every so often, his gaze drifted toward her, a protective instinct that never turned off. He wasn't supposed to reveal himself until landing, but as the plane climbed into the night, he began to feel uneasy. Something about the body language of the woman near the front, the too bright smile, the stiff shoulders, unsettled him. Years in the army had sharpened his sense for tension. He could read a room like a radar. And right now, his radar was blaring. The first small encounter, the water request, made his jaw tighten. He could hear the tone even from where he sat. He saw Kayla's posture shrink, her courage dim just slightly. He reminded himself to stay calm. Maybe it's nothing, he told himself. Maybe I'm seeing ghosts where there aren't any. But the next exchange, the way the attendant leaned in, the way passengers started glancing over, that wasn't his imagination. In that moment, the father in him wanted to stand, to move, to protect. But the soldier in him said, wait, watch, see the full picture before you act. Because sometimes justice needs witnesses. Kayla, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle, the invisible kind. Every glance, every hesitation chipped away at her confidence. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers. She thought of her dad, the stories he told her about standing tall in rooms full of doubters. They might outrank you, he'd said once, but they don't outshine you. So she lifted her chin, just a little, and stared out the window as the clouds drifted beneath her. She imagined her father in the sky somewhere nearby, maybe in another plane, smiling at her bravery. She didn't know he was just a few rows behind, heart-pounding, watching a situation quietly turning from subtle prejudice to something far more dangerous. In 30 minutes, turbulence would shake the cabin. In 40, every phone camera would be recording. But for now, everything was still. The calm before the storm. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and a ripple of motion swept through the cabin. Laughter from the front row. The muted click of champagne flutes. A flight attendant's voice, bright and practiced, filled the air like scripted cheer. Kayla sat still, hands folded neatly, trying to remember what her father had said. Blend in, baby girl, but don't disappear. The woman beside her, a pale, silver-haired passenger in a pearl necklace, had glanced at her twice already. Once when Kayla first sat down, and again when the attendant came by offering hot towels. The woman hadn't said anything cruel, but her silence spoke loud enough. Miss Turner, the same flight attendant from before, returned to the first-class cabin, smile sharp as glass. Her hair was pinned perfectly, not a strand out of place. She had the kind of face that seemed friendly from far away, but hardened up close, like hospitality painted over irritation. "Sweetheart," she said softly, bending toward Kayla's seat. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Kayla blinked, confused. "Oh, I already showed it before boarding." "Yes, I know, but just to double-check, dear." Her tone was syrupy, but her eyes weren't. Kayla hesitated, then reached into her little pink backpack. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out the folded ticket and handed it over. Miss Turner scanned it quickly, then frowned, a deliberate pause that made the nearby passengers look up. "This says first class," she said slowly. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Kayla's stomach tightened. "Yes, ma'am. My dad booked it." Miss Turner smiled again, though this time it barely held. "Of course. I just wanted to be certain." She leaned closer, her perfume strong enough to sting. "You're flying alone?" "Yes, ma'am." A small nod. "And your father, where is he meeting you?" "Washington, D.C." "Ah." The word hung in the air like an invisible judgment. "Very well." She returned the ticket and moved on, but the damage was done. Conversations paused. Eyes lingered. A man 2 seats over, expensive suit, thinning hair, gave a slow, knowing smirk, as if the whole exchange confirmed something he already believed. Kayla looked out the window again, forcing her breath steady. She wasn't sure why her throat felt tight. In Coach, Marcus saw it all. Every shift in body language. Every silent witness pretending not to notice. He clenched his jaw and stared down at his hands, willing himself not to move yet. "Let's see how far she goes," he thought grimly. "Let's see who she thinks she's talking to." The seatbelt sign flickered again, turbulence warning. The plane dipped, then steadied. Passengers murmured. Kayla's drink trembled slightly on the tray table. A few minutes later, the turbulence passed. Miss Turner returned, this time carrying a tray. She served the man in the suit, then the woman with pearls, then stopped abruptly beside Kayla. "Would you like a beverage, sweetheart?" "Yes, please. Just water." The attendant paused. "Water. We have sparkling or still." "Still, please." A second of silence. Then, the faintest roll of her eyes. "All right." She reached for a bottle, but her movement was deliberate, almost theatrical. She set the glass down too hard. Water sloshed over the edge, splashing onto Kayla's lap. Kayla gasped softly, startled. "Oh dear," Miss Turner said in a voice that carried through the cabin. "You'll have to be careful, honey. First-class linens stain easily." The man in the suit chuckled under his breath. Kayla dabbed at her skirt with the napkin, her cheeks burning. "It's okay," she whispered. Marcus's muscles tensed. He could feel every insult as if it were directed at him. He stood halfway, then stopped. A quiet voice in his head, his training officer maybe, or his own sense of restraint, whispered, "Not yet." He sat back down, but his eyes never left her. The minutes crawled by. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers reclined their seats and drifted into conversations or movies. Kayla tried to lose herself in her playlist again, but even the music couldn't drown the whispering around her. Is she lost? She said her father booked it. Maybe she got upgraded by mistake. Each comment felt like another pinprick, tiny but relentless. She looked at the attendants walking past, all smiles for everyone else, all ease, and wondered what she'd done wrong. When Miss Turner returned again, it was under the pretense of checking seat belts. She paused at Kayla's row, leaned down, and whispered, "I'm going to need to see some ID." Kayla blinked, startled. "My ID? Yes, sweetheart. Regulations. But I'm just flying to see my dad." "I understand," she said, smiling tightly. "But we've had issues before with underage passengers claiming wrong tickets. It's nothing personal." The last phrase landed like a slap. Kayla's fingers shook as she pulled her wallet from her bag. She handed over her school ID, the only one she had. Miss Turner studied it too long, lips tightening. "Middle school," she said under her breath, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Oh dear, I see." Kayla didn't understand what she meant, but she could feel what she meant. "I'll just keep this for a moment," the attendant added. "No, please. It's fine, sweetheart. Just relax." And she walked away. Marcus's heartbeat thundered in his ears. That's enough, he thought. He unbuckled quietly, stood, and began walking toward the front. A nearby passenger frowned. "Sir," the seatbelt sign. But Marcus ignored him. His steps were measured, precise, a soldier's walk. When he reached the first-class curtain, he paused, took one long breath, then stepped through. The entire cabin seemed to still at his presence. He didn't wear a uniform, but something about him commanded attention. The posture, the quiet authority in his eyes. "Excuse me," he said evenly. His voice carried, calm but unyielding. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding with my daughter." Miss Turner turned, startled. "You're your daughter?" "Yes," he said, pointing toward Kayla's seat. "The young girl you've been questioning." Whispers rippled through the rows. The flight attendant's mask faltered for a split second. "Oh, well, sir, I wasn't aware she was traveling with—" "With her father?" Marcus interrupted. "Yes, I imagine that changes things for you." "I assure you, sir, we were only following standard." He stepped closer, voice lowering to a quiet, controlled intensity that only the nearby rows could hear. "I've served this country for 22 years, ma'am. I know what standard procedure looks like, and this isn't it." Passengers shifted, sensing the weight behind his words. Miss Turner straightened defensively. "Sir, if you have a concern, I suggest you take it up with—" "I already own part of this airline." The sentence landed like thunder. Silence fell. She froze, her eyes flicking over him, trying to gauge if he was bluffing. But there was something in his tone that didn't allow doubt. "Now," Marcus continued quietly, "I'd like my daughter's ID returned, and an apology." The woman hesitated, caught between pride and panic. Slowly, she reached into her apron pocket, pulled out the ID, and handed it back to Kayla. Kayla took it silently, eyes glassy but proud. "Thank you," Marcus said, still calm. "You may return to your duties." He turned to go, but Miss Turner's voice stopped him. "Sir, if you think you can intimidate staff—" He stopped mid-step, turned. His expression didn't change, but his words cut like a blade. "Intimidation," he said softly, "is making a 12-year-old feel like she doesn't belong in a seat her father paid for." The cabin went utterly still. Then, from the back, someone began to clap. Slow, deliberate. Then another joined. And another. The sound grew, reluctant at first, then strong, filling the cabin. Ms. Turner's composure cracked. Her cheeks flushed crimson as she turned away, pretending to adjust the beverage cart. Marcus exhaled, not triumphant but tired. He turned back toward Kayla. Their eyes met, hers wide, trembling with the relief she didn't know she needed. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said it's okay now. You're safe. He returned to his seat, but the moment had already spread. Phones whispered from hands. The man in the suit was recording discreetly. The tension wasn't gone. It had simply changed shape. Because humiliation, once exposed, doesn't vanish quietly. It ripples. It reshapes reputations. It reveals truths no one wanted to confront. And this time, the truth would travel farther than that plane. After landing, the story wouldn't stay on that aircraft. It would leak through camera lenses and captions, through social feeds and hashtags. The footage of a frightened little girl in first class, and the calm, controlled father who stood for her, would reach millions. But in this moment, as the plane began its slow descent through the clouds, all Marcus cared about was the girl sitting in 2A, clutching her ID like a shield, staring out at the world below. Her innocence cracked, but not lost. She turned once to look back. Their eyes met again. He gave her a nod, quiet, reassuring. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, pouring gold across the wings. It looked like peace. But it wasn't. Not yet. Because justice wasn't found in applause. It began in what came after. The morning after the flight, Marcus awoke before dawn. He wasn't in uniform, but his mind moved like it was. Precise. Steady. Alert. The sunlight crept through the blinds of the hotel room, landing on the half-packed suitcase near the wall. Beside it sat Kayla, curled up in a chair, earbuds in, staring blankly at her phone. The faint reflection of her tear-streaked face glowed in the screen. Marcus watched her silently for a moment. There was no visible bruise, no physical scar, but her spirit had shifted. She was quieter now, more careful with her words. He hated that, because he knew that's how it starts, not with violence, but with silence. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. Again, and again. He glanced at the caller ID. Unknown number. Then another. Another. Notifications piling. Mentions. News pings. The video had gone viral overnight. A 12-second clip. A white flight attendant towering over a young black girl. A calm man standing, voice level but full of restrained fire. A crowd watching. Silent witnesses to a confrontation that had no place 35,000 feet in the air. The caption. Army captain confronts racist airline attendant for humiliating his daughter in first class. Millions of views. Tens of thousands of comments. Marcus didn't open any of them. He didn't need to. He already knew what they'd say. Support, outrage, denial, mockery. Racism disguised as perspective. He'd seen this cycle before, but this time it had his name attached. By mid-morning, the airline issued a statement. We are aware of an incident aboard Flight 247. We are conducting a full internal review and remain committed to maintaining respect and equality for all passengers. A familiar dance, polished words hiding panic. By noon, they called him in. The boardroom sat on the top floor of the airline's headquarters. Glass walls overlooking the skyline, polished floors reflecting the tension in every step. Marcus walked in wearing his uniform this time. The medals gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light. Across the table sat 6 executives, 5 men, 1 woman, all watching him with tight smiles and guarded eyes. Captain Reynolds, said the chairman, his tone clipped but cordial. Thank you for coming in so quickly. Marcus nodded. Of course. We wanted to address this matter directly. The chairman continued. As you know, the situation on Flight 247 has escalated online. We're facing significant media attention. A younger executive, mid-30s, leaned forward. To be clear, sir, we're not questioning your actions as a father, but the way the story's framed online, it's polarizing. Marcus remained still. It's only polarizing to people who can't tell right from wrong. The woman at the table cleared her throat. Mr. Reynolds, we're just trying to protect the brand image. The flight attendant involved has received threats. We're under pressure to issue a balanced statement, one that doesn't make anyone look villainized. He looked at her steadily. So you want to say everyone was right? No, that's not. Yes, it is, he interrupted quietly. That's what corporations do when truth is inconvenient. You polish it until it's dull. The room went silent. The chairman exhaled. We appreciate your service record, Captain. We know you've been instrumental in security operations and staff training. But this incident, it puts us in a delicate position. Marcus leaned back slightly. A delicate position would have been asking yourselves why a black child couldn't sit in first class without suspicion. The words hit like slow-moving shrapnel. Nobody spoke. Finally, the chairman said, "We understand your frustration, but we need to consider a resolution that protects all parties involved." Marcus smiled, not pleasantly. Protects who exactly? The company, someone muttered. He nodded once. That's what I thought. He stood, slowly, deliberately. You brought me into this boardroom because you think this is about PR. But it's not. It's about the quiet kind of racism that hides behind professionalism. The kind that wears a name tag and a smile. The kind that humiliates a child, then apologizes only when someone's watching. The chairman's fingers tapped against the table. Captain, you can't review equality, Marcus said softly. You can only practice it. He walked out before anyone could respond. The next few days blurred into interviews, public statements, and silence between father and daughter. Kayla barely spoke. The viral fame she never asked for clung to her like a shadow. Every time she looked at her phone, she saw her own face, frozen mid-fear, mid-humiliation, turned into content for strangers. At night, Marcus would hear her muffled sobs. On the fourth evening, she whispered through the dark, "Why do they hate me, Daddy?" He didn't answer right away, because he didn't have a clean answer, only a lifetime of complicated truths. He finally said, "Because some people fear what they don't understand, and because you remind them of something they can't control, Grace." She didn't reply, but her hand reached across the sheets and found his. He held it tightly. By week's end, the airline issued its final statement. The attendant has been placed on leave. The company reaffirms its commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equitable treatment of all passengers. Standard script. Empty words. A neat bow tied around something rotten. But Marcus knew this time would be different, because the story had reached far beyond his control. It wasn't just a headline anymore. It was a mirror. People were seeing themselves in it. The mothers who had been followed in stores, the sons who had been questioned for existing in the wrong spaces, the quiet professionals who had smiled through discrimination to keep their jobs. This story was theirs too. But for every voice of empathy, there were others, louder, uglier, angrier. She was just doing her job. Maybe the kid was in the wrong seat. Another race card. Marcus read each one like another cut, shallow but endless. And then the email came. Subject, urgent, federal security hearing, inquiry into conduct. He stared at it for a long time. Apparently, someone had filed an internal report claiming his aggressive demeanor on the flight violated security protocols. The same system he'd helped build was now turning inward on him. The irony burned. He was summoned to appear before a review panel in Washington. The room was colder this time, smaller. Military flags lined the walls. A seal of authority glared from behind the long table. 3 panelists. Cameras recording. Marcus stood at attention, uniform sharp, heart steady. Captain Reynolds, the lead officer began. This review concerned your behavior aboard Flight 247. According to reports, you confronted airline personnel in a manner deemed confrontational. Marcus's lips tightened. Confrontational. Yes. While we understand the personal nature of the event, the question is whether you jeopardized passenger order. He took a slow breath. I maintained control the entire time. Yet passengers began applauding? Yes, sir. Would you say you incited that reaction? No, Marcus said. Respect incited it. The officer frowned slightly. Captain, This isn't a moral review. It's procedural. With respect, Marcus replied evenly. Procedures built without morals fail every time. The second panelist, an older man, weary and indifferent, leaned forward. You're a good soldier, Marcus. Don't let emotion cloud your discipline. Marcus met his eyes. If standing up for a child being humiliated is emotional, then I'll take that over discipline any day. A pause. Long and comfortable. Then the first officer spoke again. Captain Reynolds, this review will be noted in your record. Pending further investigation, you're temporarily relieved of command. Silence. The words landed like a physical blow. He stood perfectly still, though his hands curled slightly at his sides. Understood, he said quietly. Dismissed. Outside, the hallway was silent. He walked slowly, each step echoing against marble floors. His reflection followed him along the glass walls, still tall, still proud, but carrying something heavier now. He stepped into the sunlight and closed his eyes. The weight of his medals pressed against his chest like irony made metal. He'd fought wars overseas, but the one that broke him was happening right here, in boardrooms, classrooms, airplanes, and policies. That night, he sat alone on his porch, watching the sky fade from gold to indigo. The hum of crickets filled the silence. His phone buzzed once, a new message. From unknown. Subject, thank you. Body, my daughter saw that video. She finally believes someone would stand up for her. Thank you. Marcus stared at it for a long time. Then another came. And another. Mothers. Fathers. Strangers. Each message a spark in the darkness. And in that moment, he realized something. The system could silence his title. It could strip his authority. But it couldn't erase the truth that had already taken root. In hearts, in homes, in conversations that would ripple for years. The breaking point wasn't just what happened on the plane. It was what happened after, when silence met courage and finally lost. Above him, a plane passed across the night sky, just a blinking speck of light moving through the dark. He watched it until it disappeared, wondering how many people were up there right now, and whether any of them would have the courage to speak up the next time they saw something wrong. He whispered softly to himself, maybe one more will. And with that he stood, squared his shoulders, and walked back inside, because his fight wasn't over. It had only changed altitude. 2 weeks later, the sky over Atlanta was soft gray, the kind of color that makes everything look like it's waiting for something. Marcus stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the cuff of his uniform. The brass insignia gleamed again, newly polished. The suspension had been lifted. Quietly. No public statement. No apology. Just an email. Administrative review complete. Reinstatement approved. He didn't celebrate. He just nodded once at the reflection, staring back. Because he knew reinstatement didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the silence that had followed the flight. But it meant he could move again forward. He walked out to the small kitchen where Kayla sat, dressed for school. She was stirring cereal, absently tapping her spoon against the bowl. Ready? He asked gently. She looked up, her smile small but real. Yeah, it had taken days for her to sleep without nightmares. Weeks before she stopped flinching when strangers looked at her too long. But lately, she'd started laughing again, quietly, like someone relearning the sound. They drove to school in near silence. The morning radio murmured news, politics, weather, traffic. No more headlines about Flight 247. The internet had moved on, as it always did. But not everyone had forgotten. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Marcus noticed a small group near the entrance, parents and teachers talking, their heads turning as his car slowed to a stop. Some smiled, some didn't. Kayla hesitated, glancing toward him. He reached over and touched her shoulder. You walk proud, baby girl. Always. She nodded, gathering her backpack, and stepped out. A few kids whispered as she passed. One of them, a boy from her class, waved shyly. She waved back. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Marcus waited until she disappeared inside, then exhaled. That afternoon, he received a message from the airline's corporate office. Subject, Meeting request, community outreach initiative. He frowned. He hadn't expected to hear from them again. 3 days later, he was back in the same glass building. But this time, the air felt different. The same executives sat at the table, though their tones were softer now. The chairman gestured for him to sit. "Captain Reynolds," he began, "we want to speak with you regarding next steps." Marcus folded his hands. "Go ahead." The chairman continued. "We've been reviewing our internal diversity and conduct policies. In light of recent events, we're launching an initiative, empathy and bias awareness training for all airline staff. We'd like you to help design it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You want me to help fix what almost broke me?" The woman at the table smiled faintly. "We want to make sure it never happens again." He leaned back, studying their faces. They weren't apologizing, but they were listening. For the first time, maybe sincerely. He nodded slowly. "Then let's do it right." The following months changed everything. He worked quietly, deliberately, creating workshops that didn't preach, but showed. He brought in psychologists, cultural educators, and veterans from all backgrounds. They shared stories, real ones, about small humiliations that left big scars, about the invisible walls people carried on flights, in workplaces, in daily life. Marcus didn't talk much about his own incident. He didn't have to. Everyone in those rooms already knew, and something remarkable began to happen. Attendants started sharing their own moments of guilt and ignorance. Small awakenings, whispered but real. A flight attendant once told him after a session, tears brimming, "I didn't realize how often I looked at people differently. I didn't mean to, but now I see it." That sentence stayed with him, because awareness, he realized, was the first flight toward change. Meanwhile, the video of the confrontation, the one that had once caused so much chaos, found a second life. Teachers began using it in classrooms. Clergy quoted it in sermons. Parents discussed it at dinner tables. It wasn't about the airline anymore. It was about courage, about the moment when one person decides to speak, not loudly, but firmly, in the face of quiet injustice. And through it all, Marcus stayed humble. He turned down interviews, declined sponsorship offers. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in follow-through. One evening, months later, he and Kayla sat on their porch again. The air was warm, crickets singing like they had the night everything fell apart. Kayla was taller now, a little older, a little wiser. She held a sketch pad on her lap, doodling airplanes with wings shaped like hearts. Marcus smiled. "That new art project?" She nodded. "Yeah, we had to draw something that makes us feel safe." He chuckled softly. "Airplanes make you feel safe." "Not the planes," she said, glancing up with a grin. "Just knowing you're on one." He felt a slow warmth spread in his chest. There it was, healing, quiet and complete. A week later, the airline held a press event announcing the launch of the SkyKind Initiative, a global empathy training program for flight crews. Marcus stood backstage, dressed in a simple gray suit, not his uniform this time. He didn't want medals in the spotlight, just meaning. When they called his name, he stepped forward to quiet applause. Cameras flashed. He didn't read from the notes in his pocket. He didn't need them. He looked at the crowd and began simply. 6 months ago, I was on a flight that reminded me how easily dignity can be taken, and how quickly it can be defended. What happened that day wasn't about a company or a crew member. It was about reflection, about how each of us carries the power to make someone feel seen or small. He paused. The room was utterly still. He continued, "Empathy isn't a policy. It's a choice, and it's one we have to keep making every single day." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was gentle, the kind that lingers longer because it comes from the heart. Later, as he left the stage, a woman approached him, older, kind eyes, clutching a photo. "My son," she said softly, holding out the picture. "He's 12. He saw your video. Said he wants to grow up and be like you. Someone who speaks up, even when it's hard." Marcus looked at the photo. A smiling boy with bright eyes and a wide grin. He smiled back. "Tell him he already is." That night, Marcus drove home in silence, the city lights flickering across his windshield. He thought about the irony, how something so painful had become something so purposeful. He thought about Kayla's laughter, her courage returning. He thought about how sometimes the hardest moments plant seeds that bloom long after the noise fades. When he pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on. Kayla ran out to meet him, holding something behind her back. "What's that?" he asked. She grinned, handing him a small card she'd made, folded construction paper, messy handwriting. Inside it read, "To my hero, for teaching the world to listen." Marcus swallowed hard, blinking fast. He knelt down and hugged her tight. No words, just the kind of silence that feels like peace. That weekend, they took another flight. Same airline, different route. Kayla sat by the window this time, sketchpad open, head resting against the glass. The attendant, a young man with warm eyes, smiled as he passed. "Can I get you anything, miss?" Kayla shook her head politely. "No, thank you." Marcus watched her, his heart full. The plane began to rise, higher, smoother, lighter. And as the clouds opened up beneath them, he realized something profound. Some journeys aren't about where you're going. They're about what you refuse to leave behind. He closed his eyes, the hum of the engines steady and familiar. For the first time in a long while, he let himself feel proud, not for the uniform, not for the headlines, but for the quiet victory no one else could see. The victory of staying kind in a world that wasn't. Outside the window, the sun dipped below the clouds, painting the sky gold, then amber, then soft purple. Kayla pointed. "It looks like it's saying sorry," she whispered. Marcus smiled. "Maybe it is." And as the plane soared higher, the world below shrank into distance, all the pain, the noise, the judgment, until there was only light. Pure, forgiving light. The engine slowed, and for the first time since takeoff, the cabin felt still. The storm had passed, but the air inside the plane carried a different kind of quiet, the kind that follows truth when it's finally spoken aloud. Lena sat by the window, her hands resting in her lap, her reflection faint in the glass. Outside, dawn stretched across the clouds like a promise. The light caught the corner of her face, softening the traces of everything she'd just been through. She was only 13, but in that stillness, she carried the calm of someone who had seen the world shift and understood a piece of it that most adults never would. Her father sat beside her, silent, steady, composed once again. The fury that had once burned in him had cooled into something heavier and deeper resolve. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. Every passenger on that plane had seen what he stood for, and they wouldn't forget it. When the plane touched down, the wheels hitting the runway with a deep, final thud, no one clapped. No one spoke. People glanced toward the man in uniform, then toward the young girl who sat beside him, her posture small but unbroken. Some nodded quietly, out of respect. Others turned away, unable to face the reflection of what they'd witnessed in themselves. The moment wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about awareness, about the truth that can't be unseen once the light hits it. A week later, the story began to spread. A video clip recorded by another passenger found its way online. It wasn't edited for drama. It was quiet, grainy, imperfect. But the silence in it spoke louder than any headline. People watched a man stand between cruelty and innocence, and the world stopped to listen. The airline released a statement. Policies changed. Apologies were issued. But for Marcus Hale, none of that was the victory. The victory was watching his daughter smile again. Not the fragile, uncertain smile she wore after the flight, but the real one that returned days later, when she realized that what happened to her had sparked something bigger than pain. Lena didn't just survive a moment of hate. She witnessed what integrity looks like when it's tested in front of the world. Her father never spoke publicly about the incident. When reporters called, he turned them away. "It's not about me," he told them once, quietly. "It's about what kind of world she's going to grow up in." And maybe that was the truest part of all of it. Because what happened on that plane wasn't just a story about racism. It was about silence. How easy it is to look away. How powerful it becomes when someone finally refuses to. There are moments that divide time, before and after. That flight became one of them. Before it, Lena believed the world was fair if you worked hard and stayed kind. After it, she understood that some people would still see her through a lens she didn't choose. But she also learned that courage could rewrite that lens, that even a small act of standing up could ripple farther than fear ever could. Her father knew that, too. Years of service had taught him that battles aren't always fought with weapons or commands. Some are fought in silence, in crowded rooms, at 30,000 feet. In the moments when you decide whether to let something wrong pass unnoticed or to stop it cold. When he looked at his daughter now, he saw more than the little girl he had once carried in his arms. He saw a reflection of everything he had hoped to protect: dignity, strength, and grace. And for the first time in a long while, he believed that maybe this generation, her generation, would be the one to finish the fight he'd spent his life beginning. Sometimes, change doesn't come from power. It comes from decency, from the quiet insistence that no one should ever feel small for existing. The flight that began as another ordinary morning became a mirror for an entire nation, one that asked an old question with new urgency. Who are we when no one's watching? The answer, perhaps, is what we choose to do next. Because every person on that plane went home different. Some ashamed, some inspired, some determined to never stay silent again. And that's how movements start. Not with crowds or cameras, but with single, undeniable moments of truth. For Lena, life went on. She returned to school, sat in classrooms filled with laughter and chatter, and sometimes, when the memory surfaced, she'd close her eyes and remind herself of the lesson she'd learned high above the clouds, that even in the darkest moments, she was never powerless. And for her father, the man who had stood tall in that narrow aisle, who turned fury into grace, every flight after that one carried a different weight. He'd look at the faces boarding the plane, at strangers of every color and story, and think about how easily the world could change if everyone decided to protect one another the way a parent protects a child. He didn't believe the world would change overnight, but he did believe this: that compassion once seen can't be unseen, that courage once shown can't be forgotten, and that sometimes all it takes to expose injustice is one person who refuses to let it fly quietly above the clouds. That flight didn't just land in a new city. It landed in a new kind of truth, a truth that would follow everyone who watched it unfold, lingering in the quiet spaces between memory and conscience. And maybe that's where change really begins, not in laws or statements, but in hearts that decide never to look away again. If this story touched you, share it. Your like, your comment, your voice. They remind the world that stories like this matter. And together, maybe we can make sure no one ever has to fight to belong at 30,000 feet again.